Minion was once a very prominent creature type in Magic. It was introduced in Mirage, where it appeared on Shauku's Minion. Generally, it's a class creature type that is meant to convey that the creature is a member of an evil-aligned faction. While it has appeared on creatures with various different allegiances, most frequently the creature type appears on creatures who are affiliated with the Phyrexians or Dominaria's Cabal. We don't see the creature type very often these days, but back when almost all sets were on Dominaria, it appeared quite often, especially in Odyssey block where the type even receives some payoffs. In all, there are 45 cards which either have the minion creature type or create a minion creature token, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic the Gathering. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it's Sleeper Agent. For 1 black mana, it's a 3/3, and when it enters, target opponent gains control of it. Then at the beginning of your upkeep, the creature does 2 damage to you, and by you it means the controller. So the stat line here is obviously quite efficient, but you don't get to reap the benefits. Instead, it's more like a downside to giving your opponent a card that makes them take 2 damage every upkeep. Despite originally being printed in 1998's Urza's Saga, Sleeper Agent didn't actually see any play until quite recently, when it began to appear in black burn decks in Modern. These decks were enabled largely by the printing of Necro Dominance, which lets you draw a whole bunch of cards if you're willing to pay life, and the deck is definitely willing to do it because it can exile those cards to Soul Spike to gain life and do damage to the opponent. Sleeper Agent is a nice fit in the deck because it helps burn out the opponent, and because you're so good at gaining life, you don't care too much about giving your opponent a 3/3. Despite being at number 10, Sleeper Agent has been active the most recently of any card on this list, and that might mean it moves higher on it in the future. At number 9, it's Dauthi Mindripper. It has the same total score as Sleeper Agent, but it got the higher spot on the list as a result of having more Pro Tour top 8s. For 3 generic and a black, it's a 2/1 with Shadow, which means it can only block and be blocked by other creatures with Shadow, and whenever it attacks and isn't blocked, you can choose to sacrifice it to make the defending player discard 3 cards. Shadow making this hard to block is great, because it means you can rip your opponent's hand apart pretty easily. Making your opponent discard 3 is a 3-for-1, after all. It achieved its 1 Pro Tour top 8 at the Tempest Block Pro Tour in a deck that was good at temporarily reanimating creatures with Corpse Dance. Because the Mindripper could put itself in the graveyard with its own ability, it wasn't hard to empty your opponent's entire hand by reanimating it and making them discard again on your next turn. Dauthi Mindripper hasn't managed any top 8 since 1998 though. At number 8, it's Phage, the Untouchable. For 3 generic and 4 black, she's a 4/4, and when she deals combat damage to a creature, that creature gets destroyed, and when she does combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. Obviously that's crazy strong, and makes this creature into an alternate win condition. Luckily, Wizards of the Coast realized how absurd she'd be as a creature to cheat into play with reanimation and other means, so they also gave her that first ability, which makes you lose the game if she enters without having been cast from your hand. However, between 2007 and 2009, people found a few ways to win the game with Phage, despite that huge hurdle. You could, for example, use Stifle to negate her game-losing effect, or you could put her in the graveyard and copy her with Volrath's Shapeshifter, so you still had a creature that would win the game if it hit your opponent without the downside, and you could get it going a lot earlier too. However, those strategies haven't been viable in Legacy or Vintage for a very long time. At number 7, it's Gloomdrifter. For 3 generic and a black, it's a 2/2 with flying, and if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard when it enters, non-black creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. So if you're playing a mono-black deck and you're good at getting Threshold, Gloomdrifter's enters trigger is pretty good at wiping away your opponent's early plays without hurting yours. It saw sideboard play in Psychotog decks in both Standard and Block. These were control decks that could win the game with the eponymous Atog, and thus they had lots of ways to load the graveyard. Gloomdrifter was particularly useful against aggro decks where most creatures would simply die from the trigger. However, Gloomdrifter doesn't have any top 8 since 2002. At number 6, it's Sadistic Hypnotist. For 3 generic and 2 black, it's a 2/2, and it can sacrifice a creature to make the opponent discard 2 cards, albeit only at sorcery speed. Sacrifice effects that don't cost mana are often easy to abuse, and this one can disrupt your opponent in a big way. The Hypnotist saw play in Legacy between 2010 and 2013. There it was featured in Dredge decks, which could get lots of bodies out of the graveyard, like Bloodghast and Icarid. These decks like to use Cabal Therapy to disrupt the opponent, and Sadistic Hypnotist kind of gave you additional copies of that card, since you could use those bodies to disrupt the opponent with the Hypnotist's ability too. It was also played in Survival of the Fittest decks, which could search up the Hypnotist when it was particularly potent, and also put it into the graveyard with the option of getting it back later. However, Survival got banned in 2010, limiting the Hypnotist to only seeing play in some Dredge decks, and it doesn't have any top 8s anywhere since 2013. At number 5, it's Body Snatcher. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 2/2, and when it enters, you exile it unless you discard a creature card. Then when the Snatcher dies, you exile it and return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. In other words, it's a roundabout way to reanimate things, but it's kind of a one-stop shop because it can load the graveyard with what you want to reanimate, while also giving you a way to reanimate it, although you do need to find a way to kill the Snatcher. It's another minion that took a while to find a home, but it ended up being a pretty impressive card for combo decks in the Eternal formats between 2007 and 2008. And its success all revolved around the fact that Flash was restored to its full power in 2007. For a while, Flash was under a power level erratum. Not something they do very often today, but it was pretty common in the old days. And during that time, Flash instead said, choose a creature card in your hand, you may pay its mana cost reduced by up to 2. If you do, put that card into play. If you don't, put that card into your graveyard. But in 2007, they got rid of power level erratum and made it work how it originally did. That is, the creature you choose with Flash enters the battlefield and then gets sacrificed if you don't pay the extra mana. This is markedly more powerful, as it allows you to take advantage of super powerful death triggers. This was most famously achieved with Protean Hulk, who alongside Flash and some fast mana could easily tutor up a series of creatures that would win the game on turn 1. You did this by grabbing Karmic Guide and Carrion Feeder, using the guide to reanimate the Hulk, and then sacrificing it again to the feeder, and then you would search up Kiki Jiki. You can now use Kiki Jiki to make a copy of the guide, and sacrifice Kiki to the feeder, and use each copy to reanimate Kiki Jiki over and over again, and each time Kiki makes a new copy. Then you end up with enough guides to swing away for lethal. Now, you may have noticed Body Snatcher isn't actually part of the combo, but it was an important insurance policy for the deck. Most of the cards you tutor up are only singleton cards, and if one of those combo pieces got stuck in your hand, you'd be out of luck. That is, if you couldn't tutor up Body Snatcher to discard the combo piece, and then get it back by sacrificing the Snatcher. The Flash Hulk deck was so busted that the newly empowered Flash got banned following only a single event, but Flash Hulk decks continued to be a thing in Vintage into 2008, until it got restricted in that format too, putting an end to the deck, and also putting an end to Body Snatcher's usefulness in the format. At number 4, it's Stronghold Taskmaster. For 2 generic and 2 black, it's a 4/3, and it gives all other black creatures -1/-1. This is a weird card, since it's a black card that hates on other black cards, and it isn't like it's so overstated that the downside was worth it, even back in 1998. However, if you're playing a black deck that doesn't run that many actual black creatures, the Taskmaster is a pretty nice hate piece against other black decks. In Standard and Extended between 1999 and 2002, it was largely a sideboard card. In Standard, one of the best decks was Suicide Black, which ran lots of aggressive black creatures like Dauthi Horror, and against a deck like that, control decks with no black creatures of their own could bring in the Taskmaster, where it becomes a 4/3 that weakens the opponent's entire board. In Extended, it was good at hating on a variety of cards, but perhaps the most notable one was Cavern Harpy, which was part of Aluren combo decks, which simply would get Aluren in play alongside Cavern Harpy and Cloud of Fairies. Aluren lets you play those cheap creatures for free, and that means Cloud of Fairies nets you mana because it untaps lands, and then you can use the Harpy to bounce the fairies, and then the Harpy's own ability to bounce itself, and you keep going until you have enough mana. Cavern Harpy is the key to all of this, and it's normally super hard to interact with because it can bounce itself. But Stronghold Taskmaster kills the Harpy before anything else happens, shutting the combo down entirely. So the Taskmaster had some very real uses in the late 90s and early 2000s, but it hasn't had any top 8s in a very long time. At number 3, it's Braids Cabal Minion. For 2 generic and 2 black, she's a 2/2, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices an artifact, creature, or land. The effect is symmetrical, but your opponent will have to sacrifice before you do, and obviously if you're playing Braids, you've got a deck that can withstand or even take advantage of this trigger. In Block and Standard, it was played alongside creatures like the recursive Icarid, cheap creatures with Interest triggers like Ravenous Rats, and creatures with powerful death triggers like Mind Slicer and Shambling Swarm, which would make it very difficult for your opponent to ever be ahead of you when it came to resources. So that virtually always meant your opponent was dealing with the worst that Braids could do, while you were just getting more advantages out of it. Braids doesn't have any top 8 since 2003 though, this despite a reprint in Modern Horizons 2 making it legal in Modern for the first time. It's also worth noting that Braids is banned in Commander, where it's way too good of an enabler for stacks decks, especially when you have access to her all game long in your command zone. At number 2, it's Bone Shredder. For 2 generic and a black, it's a 1/1 with flying, and when it enters, you destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. It also has Echo for 2 generic and a black, which means you have to pay that cost on your next upkeep or sacrifice the Shredder. While Echo is definitely a downside, most of the Shredder's value comes from the fact that it destroys an opposing creature and hangs around to block for a turn. Losing a 1/1 flyer at that point isn't going to hurt that much. Bone Shredder's top 8s across 3 formats have all come in decks where it was easy to tutor up, and generally as a singleton copy, because being able to easily tutor up a removal spell is a powerful thing. It's been searched up with Survival of the Fittest in all 3 formats and grabbed out of the sideboard with Living Wish in Extended and Legacy. It's actually still seeing a bit of play in Legacy these days, but it doesn't have a top 8 in any format since 2017. And at number 1, it's Phyrexian Processor. For 4 generic mana, it's an artifact, and when it enters, you may pay any amount of life. And it has an activated ability for 4 generic, and you tap the Processor to make an XX Phyrexian minion token, where X is the amount of life you paid. This has the potential to generate some pretty insane tokens, and you can even do it repeatedly. Obviously, paying life is a real cost, but if you can get going with the Processor, you're going to build a very impressive advantage, since this one card can make so many formidable bodies. It was widely played in block-constructed standard and extended decks because of the large presence of good artifact payoffs at the time. Its most frequent home was Tinker decks, which used the eponymous spell to search up whatever artifact they wanted and put it into play. Those decks had tons of mana too as a result of Metalworker and or Tolarian Academy, so playing the Processor early and using it every turn wasn't really a challenge. It also paired well with Voltaic Key, as you could use it to churn out even more creature tokens. With all the mana and untap effects the deck had available, it really wasn't that hard to churn out 2 10/10s a turn with Phyrexian Processor, and obviously that's going to get you there in the end. Phyrexian Processor doesn't have any points since 2003, but it has a very big lead on most of the cards on the list, which are almost all inactive, so it's probably going to remain the number 1 card on this list. So those are the top 10 minions in Magic. Are you building a Balthor the Stout commander deck? If so, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at creatures with specific types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.